The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Every eye locked on Jasmine Crockett, the high-profile attorney-turned-congresswoman, as she stood trembling, defiant, her voice barely masking the fury beneath. "This court is not a stage for your grandstanding, Miss Crockett," Judge Caprio stated coldly. But she didn't blink. With slow, deliberate motion, Jasmine reached into her folder and revealed a single crumpled letter, one that would flip the entire case upside down. Gasps echoed. A juror leaned forward. And with one sentence, Judge Caprio changed the course of the trial. And her life. Before we take you back to that jaw-dropping moment, hit the like button, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the courtroom that make you believe in justice. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in Providence, the kind that made everything look a little more washed out, a little more uncertain. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and puddles formed tiny mirrors on the cracked pavement outside the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and electric, an odd mix of routine proceedings and rare spectacle. Journalists huddled near the entryway, voices hushed but urgent, camera lenses poised like watchful eyes. Then came the shift, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courthouse hallway, her presence turning heads and silencing murmurs. She wore a tailored steel gray suit that clung to her figure with understated elegance, every seam ironed with precision. Her heels clicked in confident rhythm against the cold marble floors, a deliberate sound that echoed through the corridors like a gavel strike. To her right walked a young intern, barely out of law school, eyes wide and uncertain. To her left, a tall legal assistant, whose rigid posture betrayed no emotion. They formed a triangle of tension and resolve, a quiet procession entering the lion's den. Jasmine, once a bold congressional firebrand from Texas, was now the center of a different kind of attention, not for legislation or social justice, but for alleged misuse of campaign funds. The whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her, right? Isn't she the one who spoke at the rally last summer? Did she really pocket the housing money?" Just months earlier, Jasmine had stood at podiums flanked by cheering crowds, known for her thunderous speeches and unapologetic stance on racial equity and youth programs. She was a rising star, a voice for the unheard. But all of that seemed distant now, faded into the background like a campaign poster left out in the rain. The accusation was jarring, that funds from a campaign-backed youth housing initiative, an ambitious project meant to support underserved teens, had mysteriously vanished after the program's abrupt collapse. Supporters had been stunned, critics pounced, and now the legal system would have its say. Despite the storm of controversy swirling around her, Jasmine walked with the composure of someone who had spent years in public battle. Her chin was high, her stride unwavering. But if you looked closely, past the polished surface, you could see it. The weariness in her eyes, the micro-frown she fought to keep at bay. This was not a woman unshaken, only a woman unwilling to show it. There was no entourage of spin doctors or flashy PR aides trailing her today, no banner of campaign slogans or rallying cries. She carried only a slim folder under her arm and the weight of her reputation on her shoulders. She nodded politely to the bailiff at the courtroom door, an understated gesture, but one that spoke volumes. This was not the stage she had expected, not the spotlight she had chosen. But Jasmine Crockett had shown up, nonetheless. Because sometimes the real battles aren't waged behind podiums. They unfold beneath the silent gaze of a judge and the cold certainty of the law. The quiet buzz of the courtroom fell still as the clerk's voice rang out. Docket number 22,795, Jasmine Crockett. All eyes turned to the woman in the tailored navy blazer and pearls as she stepped forward. She carried herself with the calm dignity of someone used to public scrutiny, though a flicker of tension betrayed itself in her shoulders. Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and peered over the bench. A curious smile touched his lips. "Good morning, Ms. Crockett. You look familiar." A ripple of polite laughter passed through the gallery. Jasmine offered a faint smile. "I imagine I do, Your Honor." "Well," Caprio said, folding his hands on the bench, "I don't usually have congressional visitors in my courtroom, especially not ones accused of fraud." The courtroom's laughter was quieter this time, tinged with discomfort. Jasmine didn't flinch. She clasped her hands in front of her, her poise intact. The prosecutor, a wiry man in a gray suit, stepped forward and launched into his opening statement. "Your Honor, Ms. Crockett is accused of misappropriating $48,000 from a federal grant intended for the Haven Rise Youth Shelter in Dallas, a program meant to house and mentor at-risk youth. The state's audit found that instead of going to the shelter, the money was redirected to Aegis Solutions, a private consulting firm connected to her former campaign strategist, Mr. Terrence Moss." He paused, allowing the weight of the accusation to settle. "The prosecution contends that Aegis Solutions did not render any measurable services to the program. We believe this consulting firm was used as a front to funnel taxpayer money away from its intended beneficiaries and into private hands." Jasmine remained motionless, expression unreadable. Caprio nodded slowly. "Ms. Crockett, your defense?" Her attorney, a calm woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, stood. "Your Honor, the defense will show that the Haven Rise project suffered unexpected setbacks, namely, zoning conflicts with the city, which halted construction before it began. Under emergency reallocation guidelines, the funds were redirected to cover administrative and planning services related to a future site. Aegis Solutions was contracted for that purpose. There are detailed invoices and records for every dollar spent." Caprio leaned back in his chair and flipped through the case file. His eyes moved carefully across the pages, then back to Jasmine. "You were very passionate about this program," he said. "I remember seeing a press conference. You called it transformational, that it would change the lives of Dallas's most vulnerable youth." Jasmine nodded slowly. "That was my hope, yes. And instead..." Caprio's voice trailed off. He set the file down and looked at her intently. "It became another victim of the system," Jasmine said, her voice level but with a trace of sadness. "But I didn't rob it. I didn't take a dime for myself, Your Honor." Caprio tilted his head. "Then why Aegis? Why a firm tied to someone from your campaign? Can you see how that might look to the public?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "It looks bad. It looks like politics as usual. But Terrence Moss had real expertise. We didn't have time to shop around. City deadlines were closing in. He offered help, and he delivered. Maybe not perfectly, but not fraudulently." Caprio glanced back at the documents, then up at her again. "And you stand by every dollar that moved through that contract?" "I do. I wish things had gone differently. I wish I had a building to show for it. But I didn't steal from those kids. I wanted to build something for them. The system, it got in the way." For a moment, silence returned to the courtroom. Caprio rubbed his chin, deep in thought, as the gravity of the case settled over everyone like a weight. The testimony wore on, layers of paperwork and procedural details stacking like bricks. Legal jargon filled the courtroom air: contracts, zoning permits, consultant logs, expenditure breakdowns. Jasmine remained composed, her fingers laced, face unreadable. But Judge Caprio, ever the careful listener, paused in his note-taking, his gaze drifting back toward her with quiet intent. He set his pen down. "Ms. Crockett," he said gently, "may I ask you something?" Not from the record, but from the heart. She looked up, caught off guard by the tone. Yes, Your Honor. Why this shelter project? Of all things, why did this matter so much to you? She didn't speak immediately. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Then, with a breath, her voice emerged, quieter now, stripped of public armor. Because I was that kid once. A hush settled like a blanket over the room. Even the bailiff seemed to still. Caprio leaned forward slightly, hands now folded beneath his chin. I grew up in South Dallas. My father left when I was 5. My mom cleaned houses, sometimes 3, 4 a day just to keep the lights on. We moved almost every 6 months. Sometimes we had a place. Sometimes it was someone's couch, someone's basement floor. Her eyes didn't waver, though her voice trembled faintly. I remember being 10 years old and doing my homework with a flashlight under a blanket because my mom didn't want to wake the people whose house we were crashing in. I made it out because one teacher saw something in me and wouldn't let me quit. Someone gave me a shot. A murmur moved through the gallery, a soft reaction to the weight of what she was sharing. But Jasmine pressed on. That's why I fought for the funding. That's why I called it Promise 48. Do you know where that name comes from, Judge? Caprio shook his head slowly, eyes steady on her. It's for the 48 kids we hope to house and mentor every year. Not a shelter, really. A stepping stone. That's all I wanted it to be. A place that gave someone else their shot. The room was quiet now, not because a judge demanded order, but because no one dared interrupt the gravity of her story. Even the courtroom walls seemed to be listening. Caprio exhaled softly, his expression pained but thoughtful. He looked older for a moment, as if the weight of every case he'd ever heard passed through him in a single instant. But just then, the prosecutor stood. Your Honor, he said, not without sympathy, with respect to Ms. Crockett's background, intent does not absolve action. He walked toward the evidence screen and tapped a series of highlighted transactions displayed from the projector. These are the wire transfers sent to Aegis Solutions, a firm that, Your Honor, we've confirmed had no prior government contracts, no licensed consultants on staff at the time of service, and whose listed office address was a mailbox at a UPS store. Regardless of Ms. Crockett's motivations, the funds did not go to building Promise 48. They went to a shell. The weight shifted. The facts, cold and precise, hung in contrast to the warmth of Jasmine's story. Caprio nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the screen. Indeed it doesn't, he murmured, almost to himself. Intent doesn't clear misuse. Then he looked back to Jasmine, his face unreadable now. But it does explain something. The room waited, the silence charged with tension. The line between compassion and judgment stretched thinner by the second. As the hum of voices faded and the courtroom cleared for a brief recess, Judge Caprio remained seated at the bench. He sat alone, shoulders slightly hunched, his reading glasses perched at the edge of his nose as he sifted through the case file one more time. Outside the courthouse window, the sky hung low and gray, the clouds reflecting the heaviness in the room moments before. He turned another page slowly, his fingers brushing over the corner of a printed invoice from Aegis Solutions. A number stared back at him. $48,000. A number that, by itself, meant little. But paired with hope, with broken promises, with the weight of 48 children, it meant everything. Caprio sighed and leaned back in his chair. What good is a law without a soul? He whispered to no one in particular. The bailiff entered a few minutes later and gave a small nod. Court was ready to resume. Caprio stood, gathered his robe, and returned to the bench. Not as a man wielding power, but as one burdened by the responsibility of justice that doesn't always come neatly packaged in black and white. He tapped the gavel gently. Court is back in session. The attorneys returned to their places. Jasmine stepped once again into view, standing tall, though visibly tired. Her eyes met the judge's, and for a moment, time slowed. Caprio cleared his throat and addressed the court. This case, on its surface, is about financial misconduct, he began. Misuse of funds, a trail of wire transfers, paper evidence, and procedural failure. And those things matter deeply. Public trust in government hinges on the belief that money intended for the vulnerable is used responsibly, transparently. He paused, glancing toward the prosecutor, who gave a single, satisfied nod. But this courtroom does not operate solely on numbers and statutes. Laws matter, but so do lives. He turned his attention now to Jasmine. When someone steps forward and says they tried to serve the public, and then stands accused of serving themselves instead, it's our job not only to examine what happened, but why. Because that why reveals the difference between a mistake and a betrayal. Jasmine's expression didn't waver, but her chest rose slightly with each breath. She stood as if bracing for judgment. Caprio continued, his voice now softened but unwavering. Ms. Crockett, I have no doubt that you believed in Promise 48. That's clear from your history, your testimony, and the fire in your voice when you spoke about those children. Your past doesn't excuse misconduct, but it does shed light on your intentions. He leaned forward slightly. Intentions, however noble, must be matched by accountability. You, of all people, should have protected the integrity of that project, not just for your own name, but for every child it was meant to shelter. You were their voice, and you left it vulnerable. Jasmine blinked slowly. I tried, she said, her voice steady, but edged with emotion. I tried, and I failed. There was no grand defense in her tone, no defiance, just the raw truth of someone who had come face to face with the consequences of falling short, even with good intentions. Caprio nodded. Failure is not always criminal, but it is costly. He glanced down at the paperwork again. And the question this court must answer is whether your failure crossed a legal line, or merely a moral one. The room sat in thick silence, awaiting the next words from the bench. Outside, the rain began to fall. Judge Caprio was poised to deliver his preliminary ruling. The courtroom had settled into a tense silence, the kind that only comes just before a verdict. His gavel hand hovered slightly above the bench. Everyone could feel it coming, the decision that would tilt Jasmine Crockett's life one way or the other. But before he could speak, Jasmine shifted. Your Honor, she said suddenly, her voice clear but urgent, may I submit something into evidence? Caprio paused, hand lowering slowly. His gaze met hers with curiosity. Proceed, he said with a slight nod. From the inside of her folder, she carefully pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was creased at the edges, slightly yellowed from handling. She held it out as her attorney stepped forward and passed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. This, Jasmine explained, was sent to me 3 months ago. It's a letter from the director of the Dallas Zoning and Planning Board. Caprio adjusted his glasses and began reading as she continued. It confirms that Promise 48 was the target of a coordinated complaint campaign, dozens of anonymous filings that blocked construction permits, delayed inspections, and forced emergency reviews. The judge's brow furrowed as he read more intently. What the letter also confirms, Jasmine added, is that those complaints were traced back to a single source, a shell LLC linked to a competing developer. That same developer later acquired the land after the project failed. A murmur ran through the gallery like a wave. Even the prosecutor turned slightly, his posture stiffening. The consulting firm I hired, Aegis, Uncovered that, Jasmine continued, louder now. The money didn't go to ads or optics. It went to fighting sabotage. We were defending a project we didn't realize was under attack. Caprio looked up from the letter, his expression darker now, more alert. You're saying the delays, the collapse of Promise 48, were manufactured? He asked. Yes, Jasmine replied. Intentionally. And they succeeded. The project was stalled long enough to fall out of compliance. The land went back to the city and was sold to that developer's holding company within weeks. She swallowed hard. They buried this, Judge. They buried the project, hoping it would die quietly. And now they want to bury me with it. Before Caprio could respond, the prosecutor rose abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is last minute. We have not authenticated this document. It's hearsay, until proven otherwise. Caprio raised a hand, silencing the room with a calm but firm authority. Objection noted, he said coolly. But this courtroom is not just a vessel for polished narratives. It is a pursuit of truth. He turned to the clerk without hesitation. Subpoena the corporate records of the developer in question, he instructed. All zoning correspondence, land acquisition documents, and financial ties related to the Promise 48 site. I want their LC history, complaint filings, and acquisition contracts, immediately. The clerk nodded and began typing furiously. The judge sat back for a moment, his eyes returning to Jasmine. If what you're saying is true, then this case just changed shape. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging with the weight of hope. It wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't closing in on her. It was opening up. Caprio looked down again at the creased letter in his hands. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected pages. 3 long days passed, but they felt like years. In that time, the court received thousands of pages of subpoenaed records, emails, complaint forms, wire transfer logs, and zoning correspondence. It took a full legal team to comb through the evidence, and when the findings were compiled, they painted a very different picture from the one the prosecution had originally presented. Anonymous zoning complaints, dozens of them, had indeed been traced back to a single entity. That entity was a shell company, one of several used by a major Dallas developer with political ties and deep influence in city planning circles. That same developer had quietly acquired the parcel of land intended for Promise 48, just 6 weeks after the project had been declared non-compliant and defunded. There were wire transfers, too, money sent from the developer's holding company to lower-level zoning officials. Some appeared as consulting payments, others were cloaked as expedited processing fees. The pattern was unmistakable. The fix had been in. When court reconvened, the gallery was filled to capacity. Local press lined the back row, notebooks open, cameras respectfully lowered. Jasmine Crockett entered quietly, dressed in deep navy blue, her expression composed but clearly anxious. Judge Caprio took his seat with a visible gravity, the kind that made even the wooden benches feel heavy with significance. He looked at Jasmine for a long moment before speaking. Ms. Crockett, he began solemnly, this court has reviewed the newly submitted materials, corporate filings, zoning board records, and financial transactions linked to the development of the Promise 48 site. He paused. They confirm what your testimony suggested. You did not misuse those funds. You miscalculated the reach of the powerful. Jasmine inhaled sharply, her hand rising slightly to her chest. Her shoulders softened just a touch. Caprio continued, his tone now tinged with both relief and warning. Therefore, this court finds you not guilty of fraud or misappropriation of public funds. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, visibly holding back tears. Her attorney gently patted her shoulder. "But," Caprio added, raising a finger, "let this not be mistaken for a full exoneration of choices." The courtroom quieted again. "You hired a firm no one had ever heard of. You failed to disclose serious roadblocks when the project was under siege. You let politics, and perhaps pride, keep you from telling the public the full truth." Jasmine met his gaze. "I was scared," she said softly. "I didn't want to be seen as failing the people I was trying to help." Caprio nodded, not unkindly. "Fear is human, but a public servant can't afford it. Transparency isn't a favor, it's a duty." He leaned in slightly. "You stood up for something once. You better keep doing it. Just do it out in the open next time." Jasmine's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Only a tear, small and unannounced, slipped down her cheek. Caprio sat back. Case dismissed. The gavel fell, and with it, the tension in the room broke. The gallery erupted, not into a chaotic cheer, but into gentle, warm applause. It was the applause of understanding, of relief, and of respect. Even the prosecutor, now standing silently at his table, offered Jasmine a respectful nod. As she gathered her papers, Jasmine turned back toward the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, "for seeing the whole picture." Caprio simply nodded. "Make it worth something." And with that, Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courtroom, not cleared of responsibility, but renewed with purpose. Jasmine Crockett walked out of the courthouse cleared, but not unchanged. She didn't celebrate. There was no press conference, no victory lap. Just a quiet walk down the courthouse steps, past cameras and microphones, her eyes fixed forward, her purpose reborn. What the world had just witnessed wasn't a simple acquittal. It was something far rarer. Redemption earned not through perfection, but through persistence, truth, and the courage to admit failure. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine kept her promise, not to her lawyers, not to the public, but to the kids, the same ones she once was. The Promise 48 project, once buried beneath scandal and red tape, was brought back to life. But this time, it didn't happen behind closed doors. Jasmine partnered openly with city officials in San Antonio. Every dollar was accounted for, every move transparent. Local churches, businesses, and nonprofits joined hands. And in just 5 months, the first 12 rooms opened their doors. It wasn't flashy, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies with political backers, just a few beds, a few smiling volunteers, and kids, some of whom had spent nights sleeping in cars or shelters, finally having a place to call home. Her critics, of course, didn't go away. Image repair, some called it, a PR move. But for the 11-year-old boy who now had a safe place to do his homework, for the pregnant teenager who finally had her own room and her first night of uninterrupted sleep, it wasn't politics, it wasn't optics, it was home. Meanwhile, back in Providence, Judge Frank Caprio returned to his courtroom as he had for decades, calm, fair, and deeply human. But that case stayed with him. It lingered. He often found himself thinking about that moment, when a woman who had been chewed up by the machinery of suspicion stood tall again, not because someone saved her, but because she refused to stop telling the truth, even when no one was listening. It reminded him why he never retired, why he kept returning to the bench even as the years passed. One afternoon, long after the verdict, a local reporter asked Caprio what justice meant to him, really meant. He leaned back in his chair, smiled thoughtfully, and said, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about remembering why the law exists, to protect those who still believe in doing good." Those words traveled far. They were shared across news stations, blogs, and eventually social media. In a world saturated with cynicism, they struck a chord. People reposted the quote beside photos of Jasmine standing in the rain outside the courthouse and beside images of the promised 48 rooms filled with new blankets, donated books, and small backpacks. It became a message of hope in an era of doubt. Justice isn't just about the law, it's about remembering why it exists. Because even in the harshest courtrooms, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in a binder of evidence, but in the quiet strength of someone who refuses to give up on doing what's right. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind us that laws don't make society just. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell us what justice means to you. Where are you watching from? Share this video with someone who still believes the system can work when we make it work for people. And don't forget to subscribe. Because every week in this courtroom, you'll find stories that remind you, justice doesn't always wear a robe, but it always finds a way.